So this is a talk about politics. But I was specifically briefed before I came here that to talk about politics, but in no way take sides, which is a very interesting challenge in today's world. So you can keep a little mental score. If you think I'm taking sides or being partisan, you can maybe just write it down in a little note, and then we can just see how many at the end of the time. But this is about something that's much larger than politics. It's about renewing our understanding of what that is and the vision that we're pursuing. So this is the hill at the back of our camp at Noor Festival in Spain. They went through many iterations during the week. This is my favorite, of course. I imagine this being like an advertising campaign for the alt-right when we eventually get our political act together. This is Sarah Zoltash. Sarah Zoltash is an Iranian performance artist. And every morning at dawn, she would stay up all night, and at 6 a.m. when the sun rose, she would walk to the top of the hill and she would sing the Islamic call to prayer. The Islamic call to prayer is a practice that is banned from women to sing, and so as a mark of respect, she sings a Sufi version, but she sings it nonetheless because the call to prayer, and in particular Allahu Akbar, has a tainted association through acts of terrorism. And she's on her own personal mission to reimagine her understanding of what the call to prayer is, which is that it's a prayer, and it's a prayer of longing. It's a longing to return to that which we have been separated from, and it's a longing to return to the oneness, as she describes it. And in moments during nowhere, as she went up again and again to the hill, more and more people would gather. They would leave the parties and they would come to the top of the hill. And it was a moment for them to be with themselves or to mourn a loved one. And all of us have these experiences at Burns, that when we take a step out of the party, we go to the edge of the playa and we have a word with ourselves, or we go deeper. And these are often the most precious moments at Burns. And this is a far cry from the divided world we have today politically. And it's really urgent that we ask ourselves, how do we take this dream of utopia that we have and the spaces that we create, that feeling that grows with every burn, how do we take that into a very divided world, both culturally and politically? And this is a hard task, not just because we have authoritarian governments on the rise around the world, but we're also culturally divided. So much of this movement, which we think of as universal, can easily be described as metropolitan progressive elites. And there's a real cultural backlash against that, something we have to acknowledge. And so the question is, how can we get to something deeper and more intimate? And that's hard. On Tuesday morning, when you're walking down the street, it feels impossible to take the spirit of a burn into the world. Or when you look at the media or vested interests, it seems impossible. But in those moments, I'm reminded of a quote by a 20th century psychologist, Carl Rogers, that what's most personal is most universal to us. No matter what party that you support or values that you ascribe to, generally speaking, in our most intimate moments, when we really show our vulnerability, there is so much commonality between us. There is so much that we have in common, truly deep down. We are all the walking wounded. We are all sitting with the same struggles, both within ourselves and outside ourselves, and we have the same dreams and aspirations to the world. But of course, the challenge is, how do you take that insight and that experience out into the world? And this is a journey that I've been on. It's a journey to make the personal political. And so my journey began in Ireland. I grew up in Ireland at the time of the Celtic Tiger. This is the time when Ireland was the third largest economy in the world. And it was a time of great material success, but it was also a time of a huge loss of perspective. And I came of age just as Ireland was being swallowed whole by the global financial crisis. Friends of mine who left school at the age of 15 were being paid £1 for every brick that they laid in construction sites, were turfed out and had to go to Australia to work in the coal mines to earn the equivalent. And that loss of perspective and that caving in also happened on a personal level. Even though I studied psychology and was interested in the inner world, I was really a political animal. And in my desperation to get ahead, in my desperation to succeed, I lied on my CV to get a prestigious internship in Washington. I laid claim to organizing and leading an event when I was just a part of it. And it wasn't just that the organization found out, it was actually that my friends found out. And they looked at me and they said, "Why did you do that?" And at the same time, as I was doing some serious self-examination, my cousin died, Tomás Mannion. My cousin Tomos was more affectionately known as Moses because he had long curly hair, but he was also the hippie of the family. And at his funeral, his brother spoke and he said, Tomos is from a small business family, and yet he never even had a bank account, but he was the richest man amongst us. And it really hit me on a very deep level. And at the same time, I got into meditation just as a way of making sense of what was a very overwhelming experience. And it was then that I had a huge shift in perspective. I suppose I became aware for the first time that the thoughts and emotions that arise inside me are not myself. And when we go into the inner world, our perspective on the outer world dramatically changes. You can often call this a spiritual awakening or awakening of some kind. But when we become aware of where our actions come from, we know how much of what we do is there to shore up self-worth. Or when we develop a relationship with our reactions, we can see how much the media feeds our worst instincts. Or when we honor our deeper needs for purpose and for belonging, we see how much our society caters for it. And so there's a huge promise in going in and into your inner world. But I never found a politics that connected with the insights that came from that place. Couldn't find it on the center left. Definitely couldn't find it on the center right. You're probably making a note now of being partisan. But I did find it in a report by the New Economics Foundation. And this is called 21 Hours. And it was a vision of society where we would just work less and give more time to the things that matter. Our children, our family, our friends, to leisure. And it was really a vision that spoke to me. But the problem with this is that it's always dismissed as being idealistic and naive to people who often haven't tasted the fruits of that experience. And so I made a conscious decision at the age of 22 to really try and put a foot in both worlds. To put a foot in the world of the emerging alternative, but also to keep a foot in the establishment and to understand the logic that is required for ideas like that to break through. And so the first thing I did was I went to Schumacher College. Anyone who knows Schumacher College it's a very big, I describe it as Hogwarts for environmentalists. But it's basically, I did a master's in post-capitalist economics. But the first thing they said to us on the day we arrived was that if you want to create a society, if you want to create a new economy, you have to understand all of the old that you hold within you. And so even though I was studying economics, it really became a journey of personal transformation where we unlearned so much of the values and behaviors that are replete within us growing up in a late consumer society. But also in places like this, the thinking can sometimes be flaky, and I really wanted to really get a rigorous understanding of how to advocate this. And so next year, I went 180 and decided to go to the Blavatnik School of Government at Oxford University to study a master's in public policy, which is a terrible idea if you've lived in an intentional community for a year and been surrounded by hippies. The first day, the first week that we arrived, we were given a T-shirt for running a half marathon, and at the back of the T-shirt it said, "Training to run the world." So you can imagine what that does to people who already have savior complexes. But what was interesting was that in this very elite school for education, there was a sense that the self is a given, that we are who we are. We're broadly speaking homo economicus with a bit of behavioral economics thrown in. You can be left-wing, you can be right-wing. We just have to govern as best as we can. There was no sense of the transformative potential of the self, which I found very interesting. And I encountered this again when I was working for the Foreign Office. I was brought in as a scenario planner exploring the world of 2030. Now, when you do scenario planning, the first thing you do is you look at drivers of change. And we're all familiar with the drivers of change that are happening. Climate change, mass migration, full automation, the fragmentation of the nation state and larger institutions. And it's really, when you look deeply into the numbers of rising populations, of the crunch on food, water, and energy, it's a council of despair. But what I noticed was the sobriety within which this information was processed. It was a matter of fact. It was something to be managed. There was no deeper emotional processing of what was happening, but also no sense of the transformative renewal. And the conclusion that I came to from this time is that that the renewal of progress lies in a deeper experience of self. But the challenge is that that seems very naive and idealistic to people who haven't experienced that depth. Or if they have, they're often in professional or political contexts where they can't convey it. And so there's a gulf here. There's a bridge that needs to be divided or brought together. And this became very real to me. I just had a very life-changing experience with ayahuasca in Peru. And a week after, the journey of a lifetime and as deep as you can go, I got an email, a random email from the managing partner of a city law firm in London. And they said to me, we don't know really what's going on, but we know things are changing. And we're pretty sure that a bunch of 50 to 60-year-old men sitting around a board table aren't going to figure it out. And so they invited me in as a director of a law firm at the age of 28, which is a very bizarre experience. My job title was an animateur, and what they wanted was someone who could come in and bring people to life. Again, an interesting brief. So I thought this was an opportunity to really walk the talk and try and bring deep experience into this place. And so they talk about when you are in a new position of leadership, you've got 100 days. Obviously, Donald Trump has reinvented this as the first 7 days of office. You really have a narrow window of time to do something big. And so the thing that I proposed and put my political capital behind was sending the entire board on an 8-week mindfulness and cognitive behavioral therapy program, thinking that this might transform them. And at one point, I had a lot of the partners meditating on the law firm of the future on the top of the Gherkin in London. And there were times when it really felt like change was possible, but there's just something about the system that we live in that we go back to default, we go back to the daily grind. I went from trying to influence the partnership, the senior leadership, to the grassroots. And I tried to really intervene with the trainees, the new intake, Generation Y. And I really tried to introduce a culture of vulnerability, that we could just be honest about the struggles that we have in a very high-performing, competitive context. But even there, showing them TED Talks from Brené Brown, they said that's career suicide. To actually reveal what's going on inside me is a way of undermining my chances of succeeding. I left the firm, and as a kind of a parting, I don't know what the opposite of a parting shot is, but a parting gift, I recorded my exit interview where I spoke very candidly about my failures as a podcast for the whole firm to hear, which they didn't play. This has been quite disillusioning, but really it's driven me further and further to really understanding how to bridge these worlds. Because if we can't, it's really just going to be a perpetuation of this, a promise of an alternative society that remains locked into a particularly narrow group of often privileged people. And I don't think that that is good enough. I think that the world needs the kind of transformative renewal that can come from these places, even if it has to change itself in order to adapt. And so the question that we have to answer is, how can we make the personal political? Because if Burning Man or Borderland or Nowhere cannot answer that question, it will always be, on some level, perceived as a party in the desert, as a form of escapism. We have to understand what exactly is happening there that is transformative, and how to take that out into the world in a way that offers renewal. And what I want to do in today's talk is give you my sense of the beginnings of what that might be. So, to answer that question, I first feel we need to make sense of where we are in society. We're in a liminal space, a space between the old and the new. And this is a very heightened, intense, but ultimately creative space where we are asked to let go of what has come before in order to give rise to what has been called for. But it's also a very scary place. And it's a difficult place for people to be, and it's a place that requires leadership. A quote that is often used in progressive circles is a quote from Antonio Gramsci, an Italian Marxist, that the old way is dying and the new way is struggling to be born. And when we think of that quote, we often think about power structures and vested interests. If only they weren't in the way, we would have the new. But my sense is that what is struggling to be born is what's actually being withheld within us. That there are aspects of ourselves that are unable to step forward and bring about the new because of the conditioning of the old. And so what is at the heart of the old way? Well, essentially, we've designed a system based on a very narrow understanding of our needs. Instead of designing a society that had a very strong awareness and recognition of our social, emotional, and psychological needs, of the real importance of belonging, of purpose and meaning in our lives, we've largely designed our society around our material needs. And that isn't to dismiss that. The welfare state and consumer economies are also massive achievements of collective coordination and organization. But they're not enough. They're not enough in isolation. And actually what we're finding is that that old way is breaking down, and people are calling for something deeper and something truer and something more meaningful, which is what I believe Burning Man is doing when it's filling that space. But there's something deeper going on, because it's not just that it's misleading us in terms of the path to our happiness. It's also obscuring, ultimately, the work that we need to do. And the work that we need to do is ultimately on our unresolved wounds from childhood and our cultural conditioning. It's psychotherapeutic work, essentially, with a little bit of a spiritual twist. And this is something that is really not on the radar of mainstream society. In fact, the consumer society and retail politics is often a giant distraction from the work that we need to do. And the irony is that a market and a politics that infantilizes us, that prevents us from stepping forward and showing leadership, means we never have the opportunity to step outside our comfort zone and experience these aspects of ourselves that hold us back. We often experience this in relationships, when we truly open our heart and allow someone to love us. That's true stretching. But the opportunities to fully integrate and come into wholeness are in all walks of life. They're in our work life, they're in our community. And it's about designing a society that understands these needs and allows us to step into our power. But there's a challenge, because even if the old way is dying, it still lingers on. It lingers on in our culture, it lingers on in our psyches, it's reinforced by our peers, and it's incentivized in thousands of small ways in the architecture of our society. Indy Johar, who's speaking later, calls it the dark matter of the wounding machine. And this is something that we have to contend with. Because, as a general rule of thumb, unless there's a burning platform, unless a crisis happens, people generally don't like to step outside their comfort zone because of the disempowering nature of the old way. And this makes for a stagnant liminal space. Rather than being a creative space of transformation, we end up clinging to the old. And this is what we see in the rise of authoritarianism, what we see in the appeal, the emotional appeal of reactionary and nostalgic political forces. And so we have a central political task that's actually cultural. And that central political task is to invite people to experience and to understand themselves anew. And my feeling is that this kind of invitation isn't done through messaging, it's done through experience, and it's done by creating spaces. What we need is a much deeper engagement with the fundamentals of reality. The fundamentals of reality being the inevitability of our death, the vulnerability of being a human, the primacy of love, and for the silent majority, the presence of the divine. And this is what, in my sense, burner spaces do best. They acquaint us with the fundamentals of reality that disrupt the small narratives we have of ourselves or of life, the way we push people away, or the way we buy into a separated and divided world. And this is what they do best. And when entered in consciously, it ultimately is a rite of passage. It's the rite of passage that all of us need to take from adolescence to adulthood. It's a place where you go beyond the boundaries of convention. It's a place where your psychological hang-ups and cultural conditionings are exposed in the blazing heat of the sun. And it's actually through participation, through not requiring someone else to do it, but doing it yourself, by co-creation, that you're actually invited into experiencing your own power. And in experiencing your own power, you assume a responsibility that all of us have for the world. And this is what I see as the potential of the burn, inviting people into deep experience. This is me probably 5 years ago at a mainstream festival, meeting my own deep needs for connection and belonging by getting shit-faced. But what's really important is that I'm having a great time. I'm almost like the Burning Man. But the other vital thing about the burn is that it calls out all the old within you. It calls that out. It says, that's no good anymore. That's not going to work. And my own personal experience of this was last year at Nowhere Festival, where I was in a camp with a very strong activist culture that had a very strong sense of structural injustice, but also with a bunch of hippies who were all about radical honesty. And a mirror was held up to my own privilege as a man, as someone who's white, as someone who's well-educated, about the space I take up, about the power that I may have that I'm not aware of. And that's painful to hear. And the tendency is to push and resist and block that away and say, no, that's other people's shit, it's not mine. But it is. And it's something that you have to reckon with. And I'm sure all of us who have been to a burn know when we've encountered a part of ourselves that we're not proud of, and we're asked to let it go. And so I think that actually at its best, it reveals what a new vision of progress is. It's a vision of progress where all of us are working on ourselves and are growing throughout the lifetime. And that we design societies that, in one sense, provide the conditions, both the support and the challenge, to grow. And that personal growth in the future will be the lodestar of progress. But it's not all bad news. You've already seen this picture, but at the end of nowhere, I also got married. Not to this incredible, lovely woman, my friend Stefana. She gave me away. But to this guy, Rainbow, who also helped, who many of you might know from the borderland. We were on several clown police shifts. I was actually given away while Sarah Zoltash, who sings the Islamic call to prayer, sang "You Make Me Feel Like a Natural Woman," and I compare this to poor young Ronan looking to meet his deeper needs for purpose and meaning and belonging, and realized that all I needed was the security of marriage deep down. So, back to the original question: how might the deep experiences, the renewal of self that happens in burns, resolve a politically divided world? This is a big question. I think it's a question that should be approached with humility, because the politics that we're seeing today is the product of decades of forces that are now unfolding. And so it's not as if this movement will change it overnight. But I think there are certain key aspects that can really renew and reinvigorate politics. And I want to share three, which is really an invitation into a conversation about ways that you see it might as well. The first is this quote from Richard Rorty: "A talent for speaking differently rather than arguing well is the chief instrument of cultural change." Politics has become a culture war. It has become a game of polarized positions where we are dismissing out of hand the way certain people choose to see the world and live. It's dominantly between liberal progressives and social conservatives. And in many respects, the rise of Trump, which there are many factors explaining it, is, in one sense, a backlash against the dominance of the liberal progressive mindset, against the implicit disdain that is often had in mainstream culture for the values of people from lower incomes, from working class backgrounds. And rather than get locked into a war that goes nowhere, we have to understand what a new culture of political dialogue looks like that starts from a place of self-awareness and compassion and non-judgment. And that can begin with a recognition that even if we're in different parts of society, we see things different ways, there is a universalism that binds us, which is our vulnerability, that we're all the walking wounded, that we are all struggling in different ways, even if one appears more privileged than the other. And there's a really vital role to create spaces where we come together in that spirit, and a spirit that burns create. The second is that I feel that this is giving rise to a new paradigm of progress. This is giving rise to a vision of society that doesn't just meet our material needs, but meets our social, emotional, and psychological needs. That in the future, we won't just have a welfare state that is transactionally solving our problems, but is actually recognizing that much of our problems are a function of poor psychological well-being and dysfunctional social relations. And this gives rise to a politics that isn't top-down and technocratic and interventionist, but can actually work with people to step into their power and help them achieve a type of psychological flourishing. And in this time of crisis, there is no real overarching vision for society. But I feel that this is. I feel that actually the vision of society that we're waiting for, that can be embraced by the left or the right, I think those categories are irrelevant now, is a journey of conscious development, of psychological well-being, and ultimately of a vision that development of the self is flourishing. And this is a vision that takes us far beyond politics and elected representatives. This is a vision of society that all of us help each other with. All of us share the areas that we're struggling in a burner community, the places that are stretching us, where we're being called to grow. And it's actually that culture those questions, and that honesty about how we are in this moment that is the anima of a new progressive vision. And finally, it's the idea that it gives renewed urgency to the need for participatory politics. Not because elected representatives have failed us or the political process has been captured, but that participation itself calls us to experience our own power. And it's only in the experience of our own power that we can develop the wherewithal to have responsibility for the world, and that we can sit in a complex, crowded, diverse world with greater comfort. And so I feel that these three things, and many more besides, are ways in which burner culture are giving people an experience of a new vision for society. But of course, and really the point I'm making throughout this whole talk, is that nothing is real until it's experienced. Quote from John Keats. I can make these points in the outside world and they will fall on deaf ears until you've experienced the richness of really being in a space that honors your vulnerability, or where you've experienced what it means to participate and come into your power. And so it's very important that we create these spaces, not just for personal renewal, but for political renewal. And this is something that I've tried to do with Alter Ego. Last year I organized a gathering of 80 leaders in progressive politics, politicians, heads of think tanks, activists, systems changers, people from the burner community. And it was because I discovered a report by Jonathan Rowson, who's now my boss at Perspectiva, and it was called Spiritualize, Reviving Spirituality to Address 21st Century Challenges. And the basic point of the report was that, as I said before, we need a much deeper engagement with the fundamentals of reality. We need to have a public conversation about love, death, self, and soul. It is the neglected feature that is, and through its neglect, is leading to so many problematic dynamics in society. But I didn't just want to land this thinking within a progressive political movement where there's a crisis of ideas. I also wanted to create a space where we could experience the value of these ideas. So, along with panel discussions talking about the role of spirituality in revitalizing progressive politics, we also had spaces for deeper experience, very much inspired by Burns. We had Sarah Zoltash sing the Islamic call to prayer and actually teach us to sing it ourselves and go through the discomfort of having to do that. We had psychotherapy workshops where we were exploring aspects of the shadow and the unintegrated aspects of ourselves that we project onto others. And we had a death meditation where all 80 of us meditated on the last 12 hours of our life. And it's in that space that you really feel where your priorities lie. And so I believe we need to create spaces that can bridge the personal and the political. So this is next year's gathering. It's 4 days after Burning Man, if you feel like a different kind of decompression. But really, I feel that it's not just about 80 people experiencing this, or 1,000 people at the borderland, or 2,000 at nowhere. It's about 100,000 people in Sweden experiencing this. This is, I think, what the future of grassroots politics is. It's about deep experience and collective renewal. And so what we're doing is we want to partner, we are partnering with Huddle, which is a new technology platform that's been developed by a burner, Stephen Reed. And it allows anyone, anywhere, to organize a co-created gathering. You send out your invites, and whoever's invited can send out their invites, and the people who are chosen to come is through a democratic decision. You can see, and all these people are involved in the rotas, the accommodation, the transport, so it's self-organized. And then people suggest the kind of political topics and personal renewal topics they want to discuss. This just gives you a flavor of how you combine a vision to go beyond left-right with a conversation around reconstructing masculinity, with a death meditation, with a vision of a new welfare state. This is about scale. This is about trying to scale this experience so more and more people can experience it and know that it's real, and it's not something to be dismissed, and it's not something that's a fantasy. And so, when we're in this liminal space, and all of us are moving forward, not really knowing what's going on, I'm reminded of a quote that really brings these two worlds together, and it's that everything starts in mysticism and ends in politics. It starts in deep experience, when we see ourselves and society and the universe in a new way that inspires action. But it doesn't end there. It ends in the gritty, hard work of remaking and reshaping the world through the political process. This is a room full of community leaders that have the potential to be a bridge between those two worlds. And so my invitation is to recognize the times that we live in, our political times, and to make that deeply personal. Thank you.